Hello and welcome to the current episode of Unboxing Russia. My name is Pradnya, and together with Ekaterina, we are going to look today at the very powerful tools that are employed to strengthen, weaken, or at least, give it a nice knock-off to a democratic structure, or otherwise, as it is in your case, in the Russian case. Like I said, today we wanted to take the chance, after having speculated about the potential outcomes and the impacts of the re-election of Mr. Trump into the White House in the last episode.
Can we call it re-election if it came after the break of 4 years?
Yeah, well, I want to say re-election because I really hope, and I guess that is a reality, that he won't be able to stand for another election. So with the second term, we are done and dusted with it, I hope. Unless and until he really goes the long way and tries to change constitution.
Not before we get a heady dose of...
No, I didn't say that.
4 years is a long time.
4 years is a long time. Much can happen. I don't want to think about that because we can leave that to 2025, the horrors of 2025.
Yes, but we will talk today about some of the possible consequences of this re-elections.
Especially in the Russian context.
Yes, and we will try to summarize the events on the ground while avoiding falling into the military expertise, in which we are not experts at all.
Yeah.
So we will talk about preparations for negotiations, and also the contrast between discussions of these possible negotiations and these expectations of the possible, at least ceasefire, if not the actual resolution of the conflict, and the contrast, as I said, with the actual events on the ground, which can hardly be interpreted otherwise as an escalation.
So let's stick to one or two examples. The first example being recently Ukraine fired a series of long-range missiles into Russia, provided to Ukraine by its partners, and that despite a warning from the Russian president.
There were many warnings. Sometimes they were confusing. So the expression red lines is now something of a figure of fun. But the American administration, the departing American administration, allowed Ukraine to use
the missiles
at a long range.
And then there was a response from your supreme leader.
And there was a response in the shape of the Russian long-range missile, which could theoretically carry nuclear power, but fortunately for the world, it did not. And it was shown to the world as a new kind of equipment, poetically named Oreshnik, which in Russian means Hazel Bush. And here, although we will not pretend to be military experts, I will venture on a bit of nomenclature, military expertise of my own, because this Oreshnik thing, this Hazel Bush, produced a lot of questions. So why this name? What does it mean? Does it hint at anything? But quite a range of Russian armament has names connected with trees. Like there's a rocket called Poplar, there's another called Ash, there's another called Willow, so there's even one called Pinocchio. But in the Russian version, the name is Buratino, because there was a Russification of this classic.
However enticing it sounds, I don't think I want to be at the receiving end of Pinocchio.
No one does. But so it's not a new name. It's a name that demonstrates that this particular rocket belongs to a certain group. So that's how this Oreshnik actually emerged. So not only was it fired, again, sorry for using completely wrong terminology, which I suppose we are using being civilians, absolutely non-military people. But this military act was accompanied by a rhetoric act, by an address by
President Putin,
whom you called our supreme leader. Yes, supreme leader he is, and chief commander to boot. It lasted just 8 minutes.
That was quick.
It was, fortunately, because recently, again, for the last 5 years, our president has been rather long-winded in his rhetorical exercises. He likes to hear himself talk. Many people do. It's a common sin. But here he confined himself to just this modest 8 minutes, saying that this is a kind of warning to the Western countries, to the Western patrons and partners of Ukraine, that by firing, but by allowing their arms to be used against Catholic Russian territory, the internationally recognized Russian territory, they're opening themselves up as legitimate targets. And that we have this new Oreshnik wonder, which can be used against European countries. And you Europeans do not have equipment necessary to stop it. So you are defenseless before Oreshnik. And that has not been explicitly stated, but hinted that it can also be used in the nuclear form by carrying...
It is capable of carrying nuclear warheads.
Yes, small but impressive, impactful, yes, bits of nuclear
warheads.
Fuel warhead, yes. So that was the
example, the event that we want to
the event itself.
And the implications of it.
So, the implications. It's interesting how it was received. On one hand, as far as I can understand, this Hazel thing was indeed something of a novelty, although it was swiftly recognized to be an improvement on the old Soviet thing. But if it's an improvement, then it's a new thing as well. Most new things are not just new things per se, but they are developments of something that has previously been achieved. But there was no revocation of this allowance to Ukraine to use its Western arms at long-range distances. So there was no immediate effect. Within the Russian language information bubble, which is more than a bubble, it's rather a sea, the Cyrillic sector of the internet, there was some conversation that later has spread to non-Russian territory as well about this, the video part of the declaration. So, you know that we Russians have a story or a number of stories going on whether the president that is being shown to the public is the real one, whether there are doubles or no doubles, and whether you can deduce something about his health from the way he moves, he speaks, etc. He's been recently on the Valdai conference, which is the point where he meets with carefully selected international scholars and journalists and some of the Russian foreign affairs crowd. And it's not on Valdai, which is a place on the Volga River. It can be anywhere. Recently, it was more often than not in Sochi, which is the place of his southern residence. But the latest Valdai conference was the place where he appeared and was talking for like 3+ hours and seemed to be in great spirits and in pretty good physical shape, congratulated Mr. Trump on his election, on his electoral victory, and was, again, full of spirits. But that was now some weeks ago. And what was the problem with this video? He was sitting at a table in an official surrounding, holding his hands like that. And during the whole 8 minutes, while he was naturally moving his head and face and his mouth was moving, his hands and fingers were completely immobile, which was kind of suspicious. I think it were some of the German journalists, actually, who took these 8 minutes and played them at high speed, making them into like 50+ seconds of time. And that showed a contrast between the mobility of the upper part and the complete stone-like stillness of the hands. Again, this is not political science. They taught us at the university, yes, or the one that I'm attempting to teach my students, but one feels complied to engage in this kind of speculation. Yes, it is speculation. Also, the background was unusually hazy. Like, like what we mortals do when we have Zoom conferences and we don't want to show our unmade beds on the background, and we kind of
blur it out.
Blur it out, exactly. So,
but coming back to the rhetoric and how the narrative was.
This long story about hands, the stony hands of a dictator, was all to show how this rhetoric exercises can produce unexpected impressions. How people not only listen to what you say, they also look at how you look. But the rhetoric was grim, aggressive, but in a quiet, frightening way. So it was, I think, one of the best examples of his favorite mafia style, when you threaten people without sounding hysterical. So again, I
think he has handed over that department to the incoming president across the board, of being hysterical and going completely off the
rails.
No, also like off the charts completely in every sense of the term, and not following the script.
Well, we have not seen him, the newly elected American president, at that game yet.
In the new form, that's true.
In his new position. So, speaking about rhetoric that you mentioned, one can possibly interpret all this as a kind of pre-negotiation exercise.
But with what scenario in mind? Because when you're saying that it could be a pre-negotiation exercise, you're making some broad assumptions. And this is a difficult thing to speculate on, because you're operating with some assumptions and then preparing yourself for all the eventualities. So what assumptions are we looking at?
Well, we can at least follow the public discussion. And the public discussion is based on certain experiences of the previous Trump term, certain leaks from his team as to what their plans in the Russian-Ukrainian war can be, certain promises that have been made during the election campaign, and also now new appointments in the incoming Trump administration. So when you have an appointee, you can also see his or her previous history and what they have said or avoided saying about the Russian aggression in Ukraine. All this.
Is there a particularly friendly face to Moscow in the new appointments?
There's an idea that Trump's face should be the most friendly, but I don't know how far is that based on any sort of reality. Well, again, some of these people, especially during election campaign, have been saying things like we should concentrate on China, who is the real enemy, and we should try to pull China and Russia away from each other, and Ukraine is a secondary consideration. Some of them, while joining their party's position, have spoken or voted against military help to Ukraine. But now that they are preparing to step into their new official shoes, some of them are making exactly opposite declarations, thus showing the naive part of the audience, the difference between electoral rhetoric and the rhetoric of the people in office. However, if there is a plan, which again is a supposition, not a surety, if there is a plan, it may take the form of an offer to Russia to keep those territories that it physically occupies right now without international recognition, in exchange of a guarantee of Ukraine's non-admission into NATO for the next 20 years.
For the foreseeable future.
For the foreseeable future, yes. This is the skeleton of a possible agreement. In exchange, Russia could possibly promise not to enter into a military alliance with China. I'm describing all this as a person who is not doing foreign policy. So I'm not exactly aware how realistic all this may sound to real experts who know, to people like Alexander Gabuev, who know the exact state of Russia-China relations.
Today on the importance of China and BRICS in the whole expansion, looking at the US on the other side of the pond. So for whoever's interested, you should give a look at that.
If you are interested ever so much in whatever happens in China and between China and Russia and the United States, you should definitely read Gabuev. He knows his subject best. So what strikes me as a person who studies Russian political system in this whole scheme of things is the following. Russia currently is advancing on the front line. It is gaining territory. It is gaining territory at a huge cost, which could point to an expectation that we Russians should grab as much land as possible before the actual negotiations start. So if we are looking at these two planes, two levels of escalation, the actual battle on the ground movement and the symbolic rather than actual firing of Oreshnik rocket, we could translate it into preparations for future negotiations. But that would be our supposition. What is happening in reality, let me repeat, can hardly be interpreted otherwise as actual escalation. So we have theoretical possibility of negotiations on extremely hazy grounds. This skeleton of an agreement, which I have tried to describe, is the way I see it. Every other expert, every other interested party, every other political actor has their own scheme of things.
But let me go back to the notion of escalation, because like you said, this escalation serves multiple purposes. One, the most important being that it may serve as a ground for some negotiation with the United States. But having said that, the government's line so far has been, there is no war. You know, we are having a special military operation.
Yes.
And how does that add up? Because when there is no war, you cannot win a war. You just become successful in a special military operation.
Exactly so.
But how is the government justifying this extremely tedious and strenuous exercise, especially for the economy? Because at some point or the other, it is going to take its own toll.
Yes,
and that's where the whole rhetoric comes into place, because there is this anecdote that I think I just shared it with you before we started the recording of that I have an acquaintance who worked in one of the influential ministries, to put it very, as generalistically possible as it comes. And this person had the chance to visit Moscow.
And he worked in one of the influential ministry in what country?
In one of the Western partners countries.
In one of the non-friendly countries.
In one of the non-friendly countries, one of the countries you guys don't like so much, back in Moscow. And he had the chance to visit the Ministry of Emergency Situations.
Emergency Affairs, yes, emergency situation. And that was before the war.
That was before the war. And he said it was one of the most fascinating experiences that he could have been a part of, because the people who were showing him around showed him the room and said, this is the
situation then?
Yeah. And he said, this is the table and this person sits here, that person sits here. And then they didn't want to specify the last two chairs at the table as to who would sit on them. And this acquaintance of mine kept persisting. And he said, who's going to be here? Like, I'm really curious now, because you've given away far too much by saying the names of the other people at the table. So might just as well. And then after a lot of hesitation, they said, one person who sits here...
It's a priest and a doctor?
No, a psychologist and a communications expert, a spin doctor.
Oh, that's better than I expected.
As you would call it. And I think that's where the whole importance of having narratives and how you spin a particular narrative with a specific rhetoric. Like, it's not a war. We are having a special military exercise. Because if it's a war, you can lose or you can win. But if it's a military exercise, the conversation of win or lose doesn't come into the picture.
And what is also important to an autocracy, if it's a war, you have to take part in it.
Yeah.
If it's a war, it's an all-nation thing.
Yeah.
But if it's a special military operation, then it is done by special military people. You can join for excellent payment, but you also can abstain from joining. You are not required to make sacrifices. The state does not call you to lay your life on the altar of the motherland, but it invites you to a highly payable job. So that has been the concept, and that remains to be the concept until today, well, including today. And that has been one of the tools that preserved social stability in the country that now for almost 3 years has been engaged in a full-scale kinetic war. So the problem, the difficulty with this escalation exercise is exactly how you preserve the balance between threatening the world with, yes, nuclear extinction and telling your own people that nothing much is actually happening. Their lives will not change that much. So these two aims seems to be mutually contradictory.
It's also very dissonant, right? Like on the one hand, you can't just assume that if you fire a nuclear weapon at someone, the nuclear weapon is going to respect a boundary and only impact people on the other side of the boundary. And you know what I mean? Because it's just ridiculous.
Well, it depends. It depends, again, as far as I can understand, it depends on the weight and the strength.
Also, but
of
having
missile.
said that, it's also a little stupid, for a lack of better word, to assume that there will be no retaliation.
Of course.
And,
of course.
And I'm thinking, is there really no access to people within Russia to read the contradictions of what Mr. Putin's office is telling them versus what he's saying to the outside world, to contrast that with one another?
Well, that declaration, that impromptu or at least unannounced appearance of the president has, of course, it has alarmed the audiences. People don't like him appearing unannounced because it promises nothing good to them at all. So there has been many examples by now when he chose to appear in this manner. And I remember my own feelings about it. First, you get scared. You expect him to declare war on all the world, to announce that he's launching a nuclear attack, to say that Russia is severing relations with other countries, closing embassies, etc. So you sit there and expect to hear all this. And then more often than not, they say that the appearance will happen an hour later and then another 30 minutes later. And that exhausts you. And then he finally appears. And what he says does not change much immediately. And then you experience this unnatural, almost hysterical sense of relief. Like you are threatened with a lethal danger, and then it doesn't materialize. Some people tend to laugh hysterically, and we see the consequences of this because Russians are extremely attached to their own form of black humor. So if you have a plethora of jokes and pictures and memes appearing in the Russian social media, that means that people were scared a lot. And then they have
coping mechanism.
Yes, and then they have that sense of relief. Again, I would call it hysterical euphoria that often expresses itself in that kind of
It's an outlet to.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is. It's all extremely bad for public health. We are watching the levels of anxiety, the famous anxiety rating that I have quoted several times. Recently, the levels of anxiety were rather going down. They went up during the Kursk episode, and then they went down a little bit when Ukrainian forces didn't seem to be progressing and taking Kursk and then Rostov and Moscow. And then they went up again because while they were not progressing, they were not retreating either. And it appeared to be a long-term problem rather than just some isolated episode. So we will yet have to perceive, we will yet have to see how all those latest developments, together with the changes edits introduced into the Russian official nuclear doctrine, if broader public follows this kind of development, affect the anxiety levels.
Did the election of Mr. Trump contribute to sinking of anxieties or rising of anxiety?
Perhaps it contributed to the lower levels of anxiety. Because, again...
Because of the promise of
Russians,
Mr. Trump.
Yes, many Russians have the idea that Trump is better for Russia
and also
than the
probably
Democratic
for the world.
administration. Yes. As we said last time, an average Russian is much more right-wing than an average European. This is especially evident when you compare people in the educated classes. So our peers in Europe and America are much, much more left-wing than we are, than the majority of us are. That can be traced back to the trauma of Soviet repression and oppression of the free thought. So whenever we sense something leftist, for us it means communism, not welfare state and protection of minorities.
Because you're already there.
Yes. We've been there, done that, experienced that. Again, I'm not speaking about myself specifically, but
as a country, as a nation.
As a nation, as a society, yes. So, especially given the way the previous administration was presented in the official allowable Russian media, and they were presented as a bunch of weirdos who are only anxious about equal gender toilets in public places rather than real social and economic problems. In comparison to this image, of course, the Republicans generally, and even Trump individually, appear to be much more normal. So I would think that Russians were attracted and amused by the spectacle of unpredictable elections. We talked about that last time.
Yeah.
And this outcome was seen as rather better for Russia because, again, you asked how the government manages to present this very lengthy war as still something special.
And justify, legitimize it.
And distant. The main objection to an average Russian respondent to the special military operation is not its injustice or cruelty or the body toll, but its length. Why is it taking so long? That is the main question. So the appearance of American president who at least promised to end the whole thing
in 24 hours.
In 24 hours, even before he appears, he becomes president officially, of course, could have put fresh hopes into the weary hearts of Russians. According to the latest results of independent sociological services like Russian Field, we now have the historical maximum of respondents who would support peace agreement immediately. That is without de facto achieving the previously stated goals of a special military operation. Even without gaining full territory of those Ukrainian regions, which are now parts of Russia, according to the latest version of the Russian constitution. So, altogether, about a little less than 70% of respondents would support ceasefire and peace agreement for as of now.
That's a very bizarre thing, no? Like, on the one hand, there is a huge number of people who are dreading the return of Mr. Trump to the White House. And then there is an entire population, in this specific case, Russia, who are putting their hopes on this extremely, the most unpredictable people as it comes.
And pinning their hopes on a foreign leader who doesn't care two pins for them.
But he's friends with your leader, so, or that's the assumption.
At least that's the assumption.
That the big brother will help them, will help the younger brother to kind of keep his ambitions in check.
The very belief that American president, whoever he is, can at his will stop the war or prolong the war is, as you put it, bizarre.
Yeah, I don't think this is a particularly productive exercise for Mr. Putin's ego, that his own people are putting so much more faith in Mr. Trump than putting their faith in their own
Yes,
leader.
And that kind of contradicts the official picture where America is a failing power and Pax Americana is a thing of the past.
Yeah.
And now there's this, he used this expression on the Valdai Forum, the polyphonic New World Order, where every voice is being heard. So we are now back into the problem of rhetorics and assumption and the difficulty of managing your escalation game. This is not unique to presidents of nuclear powers.
No.
Many political actors use
Rhetorics.
threat of violence coupled with some actual examples of violence, but you need to use it in such a way as not to rule out the possibility of the future negotiations, bargaining, and other games. Because if you escalate too much, you lose the very point of your escalation.
That's why the spin doctor.
Yes, but if you escalate too weakly, you can be perceived as bluffing, and nothing is more dangerous to a political actor who is using violence. My one example of a political actor who seems to be pretty good at that kind of game is Iran. Iranian authorities and their retaliation of Israeli aggression. So they need to be very careful in choosing their words and in choosing their missiles. They need to answer. They can't just not answer. But if they give too much of an answer, they can provoke their opponents into actual war, which they don't want to do. But on a lower level, among people who don't even have missiles, ridiculous that we should be discussing them at all, but they are also political actors in their own small way.
In important ways, they hold a vote in many countries.
So how do they do that? How do you do escalation if you don't have even real missiles, to say nothing of nuclear rockets?
So the one example that has been going through my head since we started talking about rhetoric is that of elections in my own home state back in India. And this is not to say that India is not a nuclear power, because India is, and it is one of the most scariest pockets around the world, because it has 4 nuclear powers in the closest vicinity. You have China, you have India, you have Pakistan, and you have Russia. So if at some point there was an escalation, I think we are doomed in a very big way. But keeping that aside, talking about the doom aspect of it, rhetorics. So in my home state, there was an election last week for the state legislature, which is the state parliament.
And your home state being?
Maharashtra, which is on the western part of India, which has
imagine
Bombay.
the map of India. So where do we place?
Central west. So that's where Bombay is.
Central west.
That's where Bombay is. That's the state.
More to the south or more to the
In the center.
In the center.
Because the South Indians call us North Indians, the North Indians call us South Indians, and we really have an identity crisis. Not to say that we don't, but that's a different conversation.
How big it is and how important it is.
It is one of the biggest states in India, and it is also one of the wealthiest states in India.
Is it urbanized? Is it industrial? Is it agricultural?
It's a very industrialized, very urbanized part, and it also has the financial capital of India, which is Bombay or Mumbai, as we started calling it a few years ago. So the numbers, the statistics. So the current ruling party, which is the Bharatiya Janata Party of Mr. Modi, they, along with their partners through the alliance, they won the election with a massive majority. So you have a parliament of 288 seats, and they won about 235 seats of 288.
So it was a loyalistic voting rather than protest voting.
It was. So going into the elections, there were a lot of conversations happening, because the voter turnout this time was very impressive. So I think the last election that saw such a huge turnout was 1995. So it's been almost 30 years that it took people to really turn up in huge numbers. And just to put that in perspective, right now we are talking about, in my one state, we had 97.02 million eligible voters for this election, out of which 65% turned up for the election. So which is a huge number.
It is.
And
they elected a local legislative body.
They elected the state parliament. And this election was purely fought on, firstly, I think the opposition did not really manage to get its act together. So after the national elections, which happened earlier this year, there was a hope that the ruling part, that the trend in my home state, the government of the day in New Delhi did not really make big gains as opposed to their previous performance in the last elections. So there was this conversation happening if that will repeat and if they will also lose power in the state. And they went back with a vengeance. They went back with a vengeance in terms of how they went about framing the whole election. So a big part of the election was framed around something called as vote jihad. So I
What
think
is this?
It's a very strange kind of thing. I think I sometimes ask myself if we are the only ones who are obsessed so much about anything that has to do with Muslims as a community and just frame it as jihad. So to answer your question, what is vote jihad? So in one of the public rallies a few weeks ago, the now designated to be chief minister of my home state called out to people, and he said that if you want to stop the opposition, which presents itself as a secular force, which presents itself as a party or an alliance that wants to be the voice of the underprivileged, of the marginalized, and so on and so forth. If you want to stop them from consolidating power, and if you want to stop people who vote for them from voting as a bloc, as a voting bloc, then you have to go out. So you have voting jihad as something that people who vote for the opposition would practice, which is vote as a bloc.
So this rhetoric is aimed at non-Muslim population.
It's aimed at as a Hindu population.
Scaring them with the unified Muslim front.
And minority front. But because a huge part of that minority is Muslim.
These bad people are engaging in a voting jihad.
Yes.
And you, the good people, have to oppose that.
You have, it's your dharma. As your dharma is something which is your religion. It's your religious duty. But it's far beyond just the religious concept as the West understands it. It's your duty to go and do this act of voting. And it functioned like crazy. And I think people were saying that I did my duty for my dharma. You know, did you do yours? I stopped I gave my one vote to mitigate the impact of vote jihad. So you do your part, go out and vote. And it was a very big success. There were also a lot of other rhetoric. So one was, in Hindi, one would call it batenge to katenge, which means if we are divided, we will be cut down. And this is a very violent rhetoric. So where you're saying that if we allow ourselves to be divided as a Hindu vote, those guys are going to come and cut us down. Like,
because
literally.
They are united.
Yeah, because the
they
opposition...
were presented as some united horde.
And as the scary part. You have to be scared of something. And I think this was something which was really very bizarre, but it worked so much so that the clergy or a lot of Muslim clerics who called upon their people and said that, you should try to vote as a bloc and make sure that our vote goes to the opposition, because having this party in power is going to make things hard for us. They actually, on the condition of staying anonymous, they disclosed to some media outlets that they think it was a wrong decision to ask their followers to vote as a bloc, because now it has really come back to bite them, and they have been framed as these nasty outsiders who jihadists and who are going to just mess up the entire system. And it was there are some moments when you've not really thought through the implications of what's happened. In that sheer moment, you're just in awe of how brilliant that was as an idea, to frame it that way.
But as I understand it, as you describe it, it's really a two-step rather than one-step scheme. So first you have to scare the people with this unified Muslim front that doesn't exist, but then you have to present your own party as the only alternative, the only defender of the Hindu population.
Yeah.
But there are other parties who could also weaponize. But they
don't have the means to instrumentalize so much. So the current ruling party is also very closely tied together with an ideological organization, which is the RSS, which is not a political party, but it's a political organization, which has framed this entire notion of a Hindu nation state. And they are extremely well connected at the grassroots. You have to imagine something on the scale of a missionary movement, like from going outside, the missionaries moving out of Europe and going to other parts of the world and converting people and building up networks on the grassroots. And that is something that they're really good at, they're very adept at. So they tied forces and they went in like at a very huge grassroots exercise, convincing people. And I think it was just, it was a brilliant idea to kind of frame that entire election.
So now the electoral conversation is no longer about the politics of the government or the success or failure of the ruling
agenda
party.
was a very
It's
secondary
all about
thing.
Them against us.
Yeah, because and I think Maharashtra is also one of the privileged states which doesn't have a huge issue in terms of financial difficulties, because it's
So the
it's
economic situation there is positive.
it's fine. It's
And
well.
how large is the share of the Muslim population?
So at the moment it's about 12%. So it's not a small number.
It is not, but it's a minority.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying, that it's sometimes also very, very fascinating how statistics works.
One would have thought that the division, if it's not 50-50, at least something like 70-30.
It's about 80% of the population in Maharashtra is Hindu, roughly.
So frankly, they had nothing to be afraid of.
No, but that's what I'm saying, that's how rhetoric works. And it's a brilliant stroke. You have to hand them that,
Yes.
however grudgingly. It was a brilliant stroke. At the end of the day, it was still a democracy.
Yes.
It was
Well,
democracy
with such
at
a
work.
high turnout, if the opposition is allowed to run, if there are no repressions against alternative candidates, then yes, it's
And I
a
think
democratic election.
the sad part of it is that the opposition was absolutely in disarray. They were not able to provide a counter narrative about what their plan for the future was. They couldn't even come up with a single narrative that that could have worked as a credible alternative to this scaremongering, fear-mongering that was happening.
And that coming on the heels of their previous success.
Yeah. So I think, you remember we had this conversation about if we should have an absurd democracy or a rational autocracy. And I honestly don't have the answer yet, but I think it's a fascinating exercise and a constant reminder that any democratic setup is never a finished product.
Never.
It's
You
a
can't
constant
establish
work in
democracy once and
progress.
forever.
It's a constant work in progress. So getting carried away by your one electoral victory and getting too comfortable in that position comes back to bite you. If you don't revisit your last electoral promises, if you don't up your game, if you don't come up with new narratives. Good or bad, that's another conversation, but you are kind of bringing in a new dynamic into the equation. And that you're seeing in Germany as well. I think they treated their democracy for the longest time as a finished product. And it stopped delivering at some point for a lot of people.
Oh, not stop delivering altogether, but
For a lot of people.
yes,
It stopped delivering for people who were at the margins.
was not delivering enough. Not answering the expectations.
Or not even considering their expectations while deliberating on the bigger picture. And I think it has come back to bite them in many ways. Talking of rhetorics, because the othering of people here has also begun, and it will show in the coming elections in February.
Well, if we look at the American polling results, then we will see that even among the younger voters who are supposed to care more about, environment or gender issues, the main factor deciding the electoral behavior was the economic situation. So it's the economy stupid thing all over again. So their concern is about prices and inflation and insufficient wages.
I think in the American context, it's also this mix between capitalism, neoliberalism, and democracy, and the inability to find a sweet spot.
Yes, that's their sacred or their cursed triangle.
Yeah.
Yes, they're wandering among those three corners. But coming back to your point about rational autocracy, autocracy can be rational, but it's rational for its own good. It's rational in pursuing its main raison d'etre, the preservation of power and the concentration of resources, which may have nothing to do whatever with the concerns of the population.
Or the realities on the ground.
Yes. And
so I have a question for you, because I just mentioned this very personal moment of being in awe of this rhetoric stroke. So did you have a similar moment in the past 3 years since you have moved out of Russia and looking at Russian affairs, where you felt just a sheer sense of awe, and you're like, wow, like some brainy person really put a good spin on what to say so that it's palatable for people?
When they came up with the idea of avoiding mobilization, which nearly proved a disaster, by paying people that much money for signing up for the Ministry of Defense. And when that in turn instrumentalized families to encourage their menfolk to enlist, because it's so much money that they would never have earned half that much during their whole working time. And I knew, and now I suspect they knew as well, the typical formation of the Russian family, where the woman is sometimes also the breadwinner, but the managing head is the one. And the husband is often seen as kind of ornamental detail. So I knew that, and we called it commonplace matriarchat, which again is not making women's lives safer or better in any way, but just loading them with additional responsibility. But when I saw the authorities weaponizing that in encouraging women to frankly sell their useless men for money, and they did it. That was satanic. And when they improved on it by introducing legislation which allows people under trial and even before the trial to cancel the whole procedure and to sort of make the dead body disappear if they killed somebody by enlisting for the Ministry of Defense. So the state, by legal means, broke the legal frame that upholds the state for the sake of getting new soldiers.
So it legalized violence in a way.
It legalized the avoidance of responsibility. So do whatever you want, kill, rob, and rape. And when you're caught red-handed, you just have to say, I'm signing up. And you get the money. And you avoid responsibility. The Russian prison, which was one of our very few real institutions, you know that institutions are not good or bad in themselves, they're just durable and they're impersonal. So that was an institution. That was the place you didn't want to get to. And this kind of prevented you from doing things. And they broke that up, which was and remains, again,
first a moment
demonically effective. I didn't expect that from them. That shows some brains, but also this staggering insensibility towards not just country's welfare, but your own future.
And what kind of a generation you're raising?
What kind of, as Talleyrand said, you're preparing for yourself a sad old age.
Yeah.
You're preparing for yourself a horrible old age, but that seems to be no concern of theirs. So, après nous le déluge, to continue quoting the French sources, seems to be the motto of the day. But for the moment, it's, let me repeat, a diabolically effective scheme altogether in all its forms. The payments, the avoidance of the lifting up of responsibility, and now you can also write off your debts if you sign up. But only in the case if you have already failed to pay them. So if there are proceedings against you, then you can cancel them to the sum up to 10 million rubles, which is a lot, divided by 100, and you get the euros, the sum in euros. So they target the least responsible, the least rational, the most defenseless, people who can't even do their financial planning properly, the poorest, who get into debt and can't even manage it. So they promise them, they offer them the very devil's bargain. Sign the contract with your blood. Go and sell yourself.
I'm sure this is such a fascinating topic of rhetoric and how it's instrumentalized in for political gains.
It's a story to scare people on Halloween and later.
Yeah. But yeah, I think we can do an entire colloquium and more on that, talking of different political cultures and how they...
tales from a political scientist.
Yeah. But I think we had a good, sadly depressing conversation on how rhetoric can
So we started with the threat of nuclear war, and we end with people selling themselves for money.
So I think we covered a lot of ground in terms of all things that can go wrong.
All the scary things.
It was a Halloween special episode.
That was that Halloween special. Now we'll have a responsibility to come up with the Christmas special.
Where we play the Santa and
and
hand out goodies.
Perhaps. Can I be an elf?
We can discuss that. It's up for negotiation.
All right.
So on that note, tune in for the next Christmas episode with or without Elf and Santa. But
stay tuned. We do promise something a little bit less depressing. If there is no actual nuclear conflict in another 2 weeks'
That's the hope. The hope.
Then we'll get back to you, and we will honestly try to... Can we look at the bright side next time?
Yes, we can. It will be a conscious exercise.
And its bright side.
Using rhetoric for good things. Let's think about that. But thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you soon. Thanks.
Thank you.